All right, we are starting a brand new series today. It's on the book of Hebrews, and we are going to be walking through the book of Hebrews together. It's a perfect follow-up to Easter because it talks about the greatness of Jesus. Now, before we dive into this, I want to read to you a historical fiction piece. Now, historical fiction is it's a false story, right? That's what fiction means. It's false, but it's based in historical events, people, places, dates, times, etc. So I'm actually reading to you, this might sound crazy, but I'm reading to you from a commentary. And this commentary starts off the study of Hebrews with this story. And I was so engaged by this short story that I wanted to start off reading it to you guys. Now, just that I give credit where credit is due, this is the NIV application commentary by Guthrie. It's a phenomenal book. If you guys want to get it and follow along, you can. If not, don't worry. But I want to read to you this story. So bear with me. We are going to read this story together, and then we're going to look at a little bit of an overview of Hebrews. But I think this sets the tone for us well. So settle in. This is story time with Pastor Peter. Antonius sat alone in a deteriorating second-story apartment located in a slum on the slope of the Esquiline Hill in Rome. As rain pelted the age-worn wall outside, a plate of bread, vegetables, and a cup of sour wine rested on the makeshift table. The room had turned dark with the coming of a storm, and Antonius lit a small oil lamp against the gloom. With the light, hungry roaches materialized, scampering to the dark safety of cracks in the wall. In the apartment next door, a baby cried, and the infant's father screamed obscenities at the infant's mother. An urgent conversation rose and then faded as an unseen pair of business partners walked down the stairs. Somewhere in the muddy streets below, a unit of Roman soldiers marched past, driven under sharp orders of its commander. Antonius sat alone, thinking. That morning, his employer, a rough, burly fellow named Brutus, once again turned from the task of pricing fruits and vegetables to ridicule this young Christian. The verbal jabs had become as annoying as gnats darting to and fro in the sharp, pungent air. Brutus was big, obnoxious, and cruel. Antonius cringed against the man's emotional blows, wishing he could strike back out of his hurt and embarrassment. Each time he turned the other cheek, it received a slapping kind. Yet he bit his lip, nursed his wounded pride, and again asks for the Lord forgiveness for his thoughts. Persecution of the church in Rome had yet to result in martyrdom, but since the expulsion of the Jews under Emperor Claudius, Christians had continued to be harassed to various degrees by both Jews and pagans. Upon the expulsion, some had suffered imprisonment, beatings, and the seizure of their properties. That was almost 15 years ago now. Antonius had not been a part of the Christian church at that time, but had heard about the conflict. In fact, his own grandfather, ruler of the synagogue of the Augustines, had been one of the most outspoken opponents of the Christians. When at 17, Antonius converted to Christianity, the old man almost died, declaring Antonius dead in a shouting match that ended in tears and a tattered relationship. In recent months, abuse of the church had escalated with the amused approval of the emperor himself, and now emotional fatigue was taking toll. Footsteps in the hall, a scream in the night, meaningless events that, nevertheless, sent Antonius' hearts racing. He had been told the cost of following the Messiah, but somehow his experience was different than he expected. In the beginning, he thought his joy would never be broken, that he would always feel the presence of God. He had been taught that the Lord, the righteous judge, would vindicate his new covenant people. Did not the scriptures, speaking of the Messiah, say that God had put all things in subjection to his feet? But the church had taken a great beating lately, and members of its various house groups had become discouraged and were questioning whether or not Christ was really in control. In their hearts, they wondered if God had closed his ears against their cries for relief. Some, in their disillusionment, doubted and left the church altogether. Antonius remembered the traditions of the synagogue and the support of the Jewish community, the joys of the festivals and the solemn celebrations of the Jewish calendar. He appreciated the fellowship of Christ's community, but genuinely missed the traditions of his ancestors, and he missed the members of his family. He watched them from a distance as they walked together to the market by the Tiber River. Some of them still would not speak to him and passed him on the street like they would a Gentile. That was difficult. And today his loneliness closed in around him like a dark, damp blanket. To make matters worse, he was one of the poorer members of the church. When Antonius became a Christian, he lost his job as a tailor's apprentice in the Jewish quarter. He now spent his days sorting rotten produce, sweeping the floor, swatting flies, and receiving orders from obnoxious Roman slaves shopping for their rich mistresses. He stooped so low as to take a piece of rotten fruit home to supplement his meager food supply. Even rich men's slaves fared better than him. Earlier in the week, Gaius, the kitchen slave of an equestrian who lived in the area, tossed him a handful of overripe figs, saying, "Here, Christian, change your cannibalistic diet by eating a bit of good fruit." Laughter hung with the gnats in the air. To be poor and a Christian invited double portions of ridicule. Antonius had missed the Christian meal weekly and worship for the past 2 weeks. His heart had been cooled somewhat towards the little house group. A spiritual itch in the back of his spirit warned him, cautioning him concerning his loss of perspective, yet in recent days he'd begun to snuff such thoughts from his mind as quickly as they came. Antonius's bitterness over his current circumstances was growing, and it was slowly obscuring the truth. That night, the believers who were to meet for worship and encouragement, rumor had it the leaders had received a document from back east somewhere. Although discouraged and tempted to skip the meeting again, Antonius's curiosity was aroused, and he decided to travel the short distance to the neighborhood house at which the fellowship was to meet. Entering the gathering room, he spoke greetings to several friends who also looked tired from the day's work. The hostess offered something to drink and friendly banter, but dejection hung like a cloud over the room. When the meal was finished, the group's leader, a good and godly man of almost 70 years, finally arrived. Joseph was a bit out of breath, having come from the meeting with the other leaders halfway across the city, but he was visibly moved as he stood smiling before the group of about 20, his hands shaking slightly from advanced age. After a few words of introduction, Joseph took a deep breath and explained he had talked to the other leaders, and they had convinced that he would allow his group to be the first to read this scroll. With a twinkling in his eye, the elder opened the scroll and said, "I believe you will find this quite relevant." He unrolled the first portion of the parchment and began reading with vigor. "In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us through his Son." Those are the first words of the book of Hebrews. It's an exciting book and an interesting story. Though fiction, it seems kind of real. I was reading through that story several times this week, and I realized I kind of related to Antonius right now. The things that we are experiencing in our life are not going the way we expected them to go. In fact, there's a lot of fears and unknowns. Some of us are struggling with poverty. Some of us are wondering where our next meal is going to come from. Some of us wondering, are we going to be able to pay our mortgage? Do we need to close our business? Do we need to move out of state? Is God still listening? What's going on in our world? When will this get better? These are questions that are very real that we're struggling with, and they are not unlike Antonius's questions. In fact, he admitted, though fiction, he admitted that he struggled. Should I go to house church? Should I tune in to online worship? Sometimes we get discouraged in the face of what's going on in the world. If we take COVID out of the equation, we still have a mess of a political world. We still have a mess of a world in general. There are a lot of things going on that can discourage us. The question that is asked is, What's going to happen about all of this? Who's going to fix all of this? When will it be fixed? The book of Hebrews answers a lot of these questions in one very specific way. Now, the book of Hebrews, we're taking an overview look today. Those of you that aren't familiar with it, I want to give you kind of a brief 30,000 foot level. The book of Hebrews is a letter, and it was written to encourage Christians in time of trial. And it did so by focusing on one specific thing. In fact, there's one thing throughout the entire book of Hebrews that maintains consistency. You will find it over and over and over again. But before I tell you what that is, I want to tell you a little bit more about the book of Hebrews. It's an interesting book because the message of Hebrews was written roughly, 2,000 years ago, give or take. It was written right after Jesus was crucified, in the window of about 40 years between the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ and the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So there's a window in there that we believe it was written. It was written in the Greek language by an educated person of Jewish descent in the form of a synagogue sermon for a church located in the Greco-Roman culture. Now, this is crazy, right? So it's a sermon written in Greek to Jewish people living in Rome, right? I mean, it's taking a whole bunch of different things and combining it together. But it's interesting because it's considered an epistle when we read the scriptures. It's considered a letter. But it doesn't take the form of a letter. There's no greetings at the beginning. It starts off exactly like I just read to you. In the beginning, God spoke. It reads a lot like the book of Genesis at the very beginning, right? In the beginning, God spoke and stuff happened, right? So it doesn't have a greeting. It's not like Paul's letters. Greetings from Paul from prison to the people of Philippi, right? Or whatever letter he was writing at the time. It doesn't read like that. It reads like a sermon written by someone who is very eloquent in his words, incredibly educated in arguing in the sermon rhetoric that was found in the Jewish synagogues, where you would say, this is better than this because, and this passage speaks of God because, and here's all the supporting passages. So if you were to sit down and read this book, it's an entirety, and I would encourage you to do that. It's only 13 or 14 chapters. You would find it reads a lot like a sermon. And oftentimes, I think it's best read in its entirety rather than taking chunk by chunk by chunk, which we're going to do over the next couple weeks. But if you read it, it's its entirety. It is a really well-crafted sermon, incredibly well-crafted by a Jewish descent guy in the form of a sermon to a Greco-Roman culture. Now, the book encourages the church, the church that's hearing it, to hold fast to its faith, right? That no matter what's happening, hold fast to your faith, because our faith is grounded in something completely substantial and perfect. And this is where the main crux of the book comes through. Our theme for this series is the main theme of the book of Hebrews. Jesus is greater than everything. Jesus is greater than everything. Now, you'll find the words in the book better, greater than, so often that you'll be like, I wonder if this is a recurring theme. And it is. Jesus is greater than everything. Let me phrase it to you this way. Jesus is greater than Corona. Jesus is greater than your financial concerns. Jesus is greater than your physical health. Jesus is greater than the political leaders that we have in the world. Jesus is greater than everything. And this is what the book of Hebrews is going to remind us. And in reminding us that Jesus is greater than everything, we suddenly have a perspective for the things that are going on in our life. Now, there are some truths about Jesus that we are going to find in this book. And I want to read them to you now so that you can be encouraged by them. And then as we go through the book, you will find them. But here are the 9 truths that you will find about Jesus. That Jesus is fully God and fully man. He is a 200% being, fully God, fully man, smushed together into one being. We call this the hypostatic union. It's the fancy word for God-man, 100% God, 100% man. Jesus, as the Son of God, reveals God the Father, is the agent of all creation, and sustains all creation. We're going to learn what that means. Jesus serves as the eternal high priest. This is something that Hebrews will expound upon in great deal, that he is the eternal high priest who, as a man, understands human weakness and yet offers himself as God, the perfect sacrifice for sin. The fourth thing that we learn about Jesus is that he is superior to the angels, right? We might even phrase it this way. Jesus is greater than the angels. Jesus is greater than Moses. Jesus is greater than the Mosaic covenant. He is greater than the earthly tabernacle. He is greater than the earthly priesthood. The fifth thing that we learn is that all humanity will face eternal judgment for sin. All humanity will stand before Christ one day. The next thing is that faith is necessary to please God and participate in eternal salvation promises. Faith requires conviction of things that you've not seen, the unseen realities of God and his promises. And this faith will produce in you perseverance in the face of corona, job loss. Insert whatever you're struggling with. Number 7, this perseverance that we just talked about, it's necessary in the Christian life. And Christian people in this book are warned against falling away from their faith because of a lack of endurance. Number 8, God's promises are trustworthy, including and especially the promise of eternal salvation. And number 9, when Jesus came, he ushered in the beginning of the last days. Though they await their finality, right? We are in this in-between time, this time between times where Jesus came and we know he's coming again. And in this in-between time, we must not give up faith. We must not give up meeting together. We must not sacrifice our prayer time because Jesus is greater than anything we could ever encounter. I want to encourage you guys in the next week before we meet again digitally to read Hebrews chapter 1. You can read the entire book. In fact, I would strongly encourage you to. But if nothing else, I would encourage you to read Hebrews chapter 1. Soak in the words of Jesus. Soak in these words that are God's word from his heart to you, written by a guy who we don't even know. But God motivated him to write these words to a church that was struggling. That's where we are right now. I'm going to read the first few verses to you right now, and then we will close in prayer, and you guys can worship Jesus with the playlist. Hebrews chapter 1, reading from the Message. Going through a long line of prophets, God has been addressing our ancestors in different ways for centuries. Recently, he spoke to us directly through his Son. By his Son, God created the world in the beginning, and it will all belong to the Son at the end. This Son perfectly mirrors God and is stamped with God's nature. He holds everything together by what he says, his powerful words. And after he finished the sacrifice for sins, the Son took his honored place high in the heavens, right alongside God, far higher than any angel in rank and rule. Jesus is greater than anything.